It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
All right. Welcome to the Two Jacks election coverage, Hard Hats and Hi Viz. Hong Kong Jack, aptly named as he's a resident in Hong Kong. He's with me today. G'day, Jack. How are you?
G'day, Jack.
Have you got the plague yet? You see, Hong Kong is beset with, I think it's the fifth wave of COVID. Are you plagueless?
Well, I haven't had given myself a test. We are going to have voluntary at-home testing this week, and like a lot of people, I don't think I'll trouble the testing.
Yeah, fair enough. You may not pass an AFL COVID protocol, but you'll be okay. You'll be able to hang around long enough to get us through this election campaign. Now, I'm Jack the Insider, Peter Hoysted to my mum, and we two Jacks are veterans of election campaigns. And we call in this podcast Hard Hats and Hi Viz because that's what election campaigns have become. Every day you'll see Scotty and Elbow and the gear. They'll be doing a bit of welding badly or shampooing some poor Sheila's head badly. And the media will dutifully cover it as if every moment, trivial or otherwise, somehow matters. We're here to tell you the trivial matters don't matter. And on Hard Hats and Hi Viz, we'll steer clear of the tedious day-to-day and give you the full picture, the hard numbers, and take the piss out of the poorly rehearsed theatre of an election campaign. So, Jack, it has begun. The fake election campaign has turned horribly real. And one decided benefit of that is that all government advertising must end. Listeners will have endured every puff piece of government ads in recent times, but they must come to an end as the government enters into its caretaker phase, which is delightful news, particularly for regional viewers like myself and getting bombarded with them. But the caretaker phase began when the PM took the short 5-minute drive to Yarralumla and asked the Governor-General to issue writs and dissolve the 46th Parliament. Now, it went off pretty well, as you'd expect, but hasn't always been the same, has it, Jack? Take me back to 1983.
Well, I love the theatre of the trip to Yarralumla. It's just a great way to start an election campaign. But it's never been more amusing than in 1983 when Malcolm Fraser drove down to Yarralumla expecting to ask the Governor-General for an election and anticipating that he would be fighting Bill Hayden. And that was all very well. The Governor-General ticked off on it, said that's okay, we can do an election. And by the time Malcolm got back to his office in Parliament House, he discovered his opponent was Bob Hawke.
Yes, there was a fantastic Tandberg cartoon, wasn't there? The trousers down, which is prophetic in a way, now that I think about it. But Malcolm Fraser getting caught with the trousers down because he didn't have Bill Hayden to beat, but he had Bob Hawke, and of course he got flogged. Bill Hayden probably would have beaten him though, wouldn't he, Jack?
Well, that's what Bill says. He said a drover's dog would have won that election,
Yes.
Which was the nearest Bill came to bitterness about that, which was pretty good, really.
Yeah, well, he became the Foreign Affairs Minister, and then he became Governor-General himself, and issued the writs himself. Peered out through the curtains and saw the C1 come up the driveway.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Look, that was a very funny moment. Look, it is, of course, the Governor-General just does as he's told, basically, and if the Prime Minister says, my advice is that you dissolve the Parliament and issue writs for the next election, that's exactly what the Governor-General does.
Yes, sometimes there's a bit of backwards and forwards if it's an early election, but yes, in the end, the Governor-General will do what he's advised.
And of course, this government...
Or what she's advised, as the case may be.
Yes, indeed. But in this case, we have a government that has run its course, and it was only a matter of basically ticking off on all of that. We have a May election coming, and we had 2019, Jack. It was the miracle, the Morrison miracle. and every pundit around the place had opted otherwise. Indeed, the polling was pointing otherwise. So do we require another Morrison miracle? Are we going to get two?
Was it a Morrison miracle or were the polls just wrong?
Well, the poll. We'll talk about polling in a little while and why it can go wrong. But one of the effects of the 2019 election was to drag a lot of more Labor seats into that marginal territory. And marginal seat is defined by a margin on a two-party preferred basis of less than 5%. The coalition holds 14 marginal seats by that definition, and Labor holds 18. And that tells you a couple of things that can go wrong for Labor this time around. That the coalition might be able to pick up some seats. And look, one seat that I'll identify right now, Solomon in the Northern Territory, where Warren Snowden, one of the veterans of Parliament, Labor MP for Solomon, is retiring, and that puts that seat in play as far as I'm concerned. So of the 18 that Labor hold by less than 5%, 9 of them are in New South Wales, a lot of them in the regions, a lot of them in the outer suburbs, 4 in Queensland, 2 in Western Australia, and Victoria has 2 as well, the ever marginal Corangamite and Dunkley. Corangamite in the Geelong area and Dunkley in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. So that sort of might create a little bit of a buffer for Morrison to, if they can pick up a few there, it means Labor has to go just that step further. In order to win, I should have started this way. In order to win, Labor needs to gain 8 to form government in its own right, 8 seats. And it has 1 in the bag nominally after a redistribution in Victoria created the seat of Hawke after Bob in Melbourne's outer west, which nominally it holds by about 14%. So 7 essentially to win. And every one you lose, is the point I'm trying to make, makes that job even harder.
One wonders whether Bob Hawke would ever have visited that electorate.
Well, where it is, I mean, lovely part of the world, on the fringes, sort of between Melbourne and Ballarat, that sort of area. I mean, there just wouldn't have been too many houses in those days.
Is there a racecourse there?
Well, Geelong. There's a racetrack at Geelong.
I suppose that's true, yeah. There would need to have been a racecourse or a golf course for Bob Hawke to have visited.
There was very little development, of course. You know, it was just this vast space between Hoppers Crossing and Werribee on the road to Geelong. And so some of that is Hawke now, which spreads out on sort of halfway to Ballarat. But yes, a nominal Labor hold. The coalition has 14 seats on that sort of razor marginal, the margin of less than 5%. Queensland, there's 4. That includes Peter Dutton's seat of Dixon, Longman, Leichhardt, and Brisbane. Victoria, Chisholm, Casey, Higgins, and Deakin. All Melbourne-based seats, all in the east, aren't they? Casey, Higgins, 2 in New South Wales, Reid and Robertson. Robertson being on the Central Coast. Reid is a sort of, what do we call it? Not inner west, I guess. Not outer west, it's more west. It's right in the middle. And Tasmania, and there are sort of perpetual marginals coming through there, Bass and Braddon. And 1 apiece in Western Australia, Swan, and South Australia, Boothby. And polling in 2 of the Queensland marginals shows Labor making no inroads. So that's the thing. When we do look at our polling, then we see the two-party preferred stuff very similar to 2019, Jack.
Yeah, it is.
Big margins, 45, 55, 46, 54.
At this stage, that's correct, yes.
And it has been that way consistently for a while, hasn't it? Really,
has.
the wheels started falling off for the coalition in polling, going back to, I would say, around about the time of the vaccine rollout. A little bit later than that, to be honest, but perhaps that was an impact of it. Since then it's been around about 47, 53, 46, 54, and most recently 45, 55. The news poll released on the 4th of April, which gives the coalition an extra point. They were down 45, 55. The primary vote is +2 for the coalition, up to 38. Labor down 3 from 41 down to 38 now, and that's the news poll. Ipsos, which is published in the Fairfax papers, they still have it at 45-55. And the other difference with news poll and Ipsos is Albanese leads preferred Prime Minister by 1 point. In news poll, Morrison leads by 1 point. Does it matter? Preferred Prime Minister, does that matter as a polling item?
No, not a great deal. And indeed, on those figures, you would expect Labor to succeed in the election, but historically, these swings are not uniform. You've got to not just win the votes; you've got to win the votes in the right seats,
in the right places. Yeah, that's what we want to sort of get to. That we're going to look at all the sort of various ways to analyse the things, and two-party preferred polling is very limited in that respect.
I've just got to apologise if you hear some bells ringing in the background. Hong Kong's a very dangerous place to live on. I'm just hoping that's just a fire drill, and that no one's coming to pick me up and take me to a government camp.
How many floors are you up there?
I'm up 8.
Oh, 8. Yeah. Well, look. If I see any smoke, I'll let you know. Come through on the camera there. I'll let you know, and you can dash out. Look, one of the things is preferred PM. Look, if you are PM, as Morrison is, you'd expect to be leading in that area. Yeah. When the opposition leader passes the PM and remains in front for a long period of time, that generally is a pretty bad sign for a sitting Prime Minister. I'd say that about preferred Prime Minister polling. Doesn't mean a lot except when that occurs, in my view. The other thing is...
The most notable example of that was in 2007 where the moment that Kim Beazley was sent to the backbench and Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard were photographed walking down the hallway together, Labor got a lead from there, and there was nothing that Howard could do to shift it. Try as he might.
That was.
But we're not really quite in that situation here.
No. So that was December 2006 to a December 2007 election where Kevin Rudd led as preferred Prime Minister for an entire 12 months. Yes. So it's in that where it is long and sustained. Albanese leads. In Ipsos, he's by a point. He's a point down in news poll. There's not a lot to be made from that.
It's not quite a 2006-2007 situation.
No, it's not at all. But one thing you would say is that approval ratings of both are in the negative, of both Albo and Morrison. Albo's are down only a couple of points in the approval versus disapproval ratings. While Scott Morrison's down -12 on that. So, look, there are other polls, of course, and Essential Poll, look, I did have a look at their figures. They're similar to what we've been quoting here. I did notice that essentialvision.com.au, if you want to have a look at more detailed demographic analysis, they do very good detailed demographic analysis. Essential Poll. You have to subscribe, but it's free. And just go to essentialvision.com.au and have a look, and you'll make all that polling available to you. They publish in The Guardian, Ipsos in the Australian Financial Review, and of course the news poll is published in the Australian. we were talking a little bit before about how polls can get things wrong, and clearly they did in 2019. There are difficulties in polling these days.
Well, it was a lot easier when everyone had a landline and everyone sat at home watching the same television station every night.
Yeah.
You knew you could call them on the landline and get an answer, but those days are all gone.
Now, what we've got with Ipsos and Newspoll and Essential Poll does do a fair bit of internet polling as well. But it's reliable stuff. It's not, the sort of junk sort of stuff you sometimes see in the newspapers. But it tends to be reliable. The telephone pollers are bending over backwards to increase their base of mobile phone respondents and getting that poll done that way. Yes, it used to be much easier, but no one's going to. I've got a landline, but not too many people in the big cities do. And then you've got sort of face-to-face polling, which is Morgan Poll does a face-to-face interview. So that comes with some issues. It tends, I would think, the Morgan Poll tends to have a little bit of a bias towards Labor, and I think that there are issues generally with face-to-face polling, particularly when you've got someone who might be a little bit on the nose in terms of a candidate and not someone who might who poll respondents might not put their hands up to on a face-to-face interview and say they're going to vote for. Maybe like Donald Trump, Jack?
Well, that was certainly the case in that presidential election. People just didn't want to tell the pollsters they were going to vote for Trump, and they did. And there's history of this going right back to in the 70s in California, where there was an unpopular candidate, I think, for mayor of LA, and people just weren't prepared. People just weren't prepared to say in public that they were going to vote for him, and in fact they did when they got in the booth.
So there are always those sorts of issues that can arise more generally in polling. One of the criticisms of the polling
particularly happens when the media are saying, as they are at the moment, that ScoMo's finished. And if that's the case, people are a bit reluctant to say, well, I'm going to vote for him.
Yeah, look, that might be the case. It might explain his negative 12 approval rating. One thing that the polling companies were criticised about was they had underestimated the other vote. Now, the other vote depends on which polling company you're looking at, but the other vote, as defined by Newspoll, is that vote not Labor, not Coalition, not FON, not the Greens, and as of fairly recently, not UAP. They're now including UAP as a separate sector, and then they've got the primary vote in Newspoll has this sort of block of about 10% of other votes. Now that sounds sort of unscientific when you look at it, and it was explained to me by the Newspoll people that they had changed their methodology. So you might, in your seat, be asked, who do you vote for, Labor, Liberal, Green, FON, or other? Now, other could mean anything, and so Newspoll now do this, and I think that their polling on certainly that other vote is pretty right. Where there is an independent, where there has been an independent or a UAP candidate, for example, they will ask the respondent whether they would vote for that party or that individual again, or whether they vote for whether they vote for them this time around. So they're getting a bit more sophisticated, Jack. Just in terms of,
it's a constant battle to try and keep up with the changing nature of society and try and make the polling work. And that, I'm sure they're doing their best. I mean, they're obviously pretty embarrassed last time. So,
well, Newspoll, just the most recent one, Greens 10% of the primary, FON 3, UAP 3, and 10% other. So that would include some of these independents. We'll talk about them in a little while. 10% for the Greens, Jack? Sounds a bit high to me. In fact, they picked up 2% of their vote from, you would imagine, Labor's primary vote went down 2%, and the Greens went up 2%. So a little bit of unhappiness there from Labor went further to the left. So I would think 10%'s a little bit high for the Greens. I reckon 8. I reckon 8's about their number. Anyway, we'll keep an eye on the polls and what shifts there are to make. But yes, on a two-party preferred basis, that's really just skimming what you might expect the result to be. And it will be reflected also in the markets. But the markets can throw up some really interesting results. So the markets have, and we're talking about the betting markets now, Labor at $1.32, Coalition at $3. There's a separate bet where there's a hung parliament at $3.10 and a straight majority either way. That's Labor or Coalition at $1.35. So they're saying the hung parliament, early days, hung parliament is a possibility, but Labor firm favourites at $1.32. They haven't, of course, got their individual seat betting organised yet. That'll come very soon, and we'll have a look at that. I looked at that stuff in 2019. There was a head-to-head stuff that was virtually you could ignore it. I mean, Labor got down to $1.08 and still managed to lose $1.08. In fact, I think one of the big agency sports bet actually paid out on the Friday before the poll. But what I did start looking at, and I was keeping detailed notes on markets changing in individual seats. And what we started seeing there were some profound shifts in Tasmania and some profound shifts in the betting in Queensland. So we'll be doing that again. We'll do that again for this podcast, and that will give you an idea that perhaps things aren't going quite as well as that two-party preferred polling indicates. That in individual seats, the seats that Labor needs to win, they're not travelling all that well. But we'll see. But the betting markets, I think, tend to show those changes much more easily. Though you can figure them out much more easily than perhaps polling will show you.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think they're both good tools, but you need to use them both together.
Yeah, the individual seat stuff really can be interesting. So what I do is develop a list of all of Australia's marginals, and then just note their prices and note their price fluctuations. And really, in 2019, it did show the coalition powering back in the Queensland marginals that Labor needed to get. We'll see if it's the same thing this time around. Now, one thing. We have an election campaign, and we'll have to deal with the dreary business of hard hats and high viz as our political leaders wander the country doing things they're not paid to do. One has to ask, in these days of pre-poll voting, a lot of pre-poll voting, does a campaign matter?
Well, I think the reason they do the hard hats and high vis is just particularly if you're Anthony Albanese, what you want to do is to make sure people recognise you and know who you are, and that's the hard job as an opposition leader, is to get a brand. Everyone knows who the Prime Minister is pretty much, but they don't always know who the opposition leader is. So you just need to be out there. It's what we call these days a branding exercise.
Yeah, and in these days of pre-polling, I mean, my view on pre-polling is, you should make it as easy as you possibly can to let people have a vote. And if they don't want to queue up, their Saturdays are pretty busy, or a particular Saturday is going to be a busy one, allow them to vote up to, I think, 14 days ahead of the poll now. And what we saw and in COVID, I suppose you'd say it was late COVID period with the New South Wales by-elections, was that about 50% of people were pre-polling.
Yeah, I like the tradition. I like the traditional approach. Going down to your local primary school or town hall or whatever, and lining
Democracy
up.
sausage.
Well, that's a very new thing. It used to be when I was a young fellow, it was always the school committee selling cakes and lamingtons.
Yeah, still do at my polling booth.
At the front, and I like that, and I like the idea of counting on the spot on the night, with scrutineers in there for the various political parties. I'm absolutely a traditionalist on that.
Yes, but overall, I think it doesn't affect a campaign that much. Yes, obviously, you're having up to half. It might not be quite as many of that in the federal election, but up to half pre-polling. But also, what we saw in 2019 is that a campaign does matter, because if people had to cast their votes at the start of it, all of them at the start of it rather than the end of it, then Labor probably would have won by quite a handy margin. So a campaign gives the opportunity for a side that's behind to come back, and a side that's in front to lose their way.
Oh, I think that happened in the election before that. I think Malcolm Fraser lost. Yeah, Malcolm Turnbull, lost ground the longer, and he had a very long campaign, and the longer it went on, the more ground he lost.
Yeah, look, that's the other thing. I mean, basically,
he was like that racehorse who got to the front too early at Flemington. It's a long straight, and he was just going up and down on the one spot by the time he got to the post.
Up the hill at Mooney Valley.
Yeah.
So, look, that's absolutely right. And those sort of 8-week campaigns are big no-nos, because there's a lot of money spent too. A lot of money. And
the more they got a good look at Malcolm, the less they liked him.
Well, I think Malcolm had to write the cheque too, didn't he, for the campaign as well, because they run out of money. So a long election campaign, I think it bothers voters too, because they're getting this constant media coverage of the hard hats and high viz sort of stuff day in, day out. It gets boring. It gets a bit boring. If there's really nothing going on in a campaign, there's no particular scandal, no major issue overshadowing or casting a shadow over the two parties, and election campaigns can become very tedious affairs. As far as
they certainly can. They certainly can.
So we agree that I suppose we agree, maybe you don't, that pre-polling is good to give people an opportunity to cast their vote without too much inconvenience. But we also do love the festival of democracy, where we can get down and have a sausage and bread. And I do actually do this. I'll have a good look at the cakes. You've got to get there early. No good turning up at 2:00 in the afternoon, a bit late by then. Yes. So, Jack, how often do we change governments? Look, let me rephrase that question. It's not how often do we change prime ministers, because we do that when there's every other year on a Wednesday around lunchtime generally.
Yep.
But how often do we change governments in this country? And the answer is not that often. This current mob, the Morrison mob, originally in Tony Abbott form and then Malcolm Turnbull form, they're looking at their 4th term in office.
Let's go back to start of your memory. You tell me your first election you can remember is 1972.
72, yeah. I'm old enough to remember 69, but I just have no memory of it. Yeah. That was the Don's Party election, 69, when Gough could have won but just didn't get enough votes. I think they had more than 50 of the two-party preferred, but they just didn't win them where they counted, and they had to wait till 72. And that's my first memory of it. And that was a tumultuous election.
So since then, we've changed governments in election in 72, 75, 83, 96, 2007 and 2013. So not very often.
Not very often.
One thing about being Prime Minister in Australia is that it's a bit like being an AFL coach. It's not a job that you can expect to retire from at a time of your own choosing. The last Australian Prime Minister who managed to do that was Bob Menzies, and I think that was in 1966.
Yes.
You hadn't even started school, I don't think. That's when the last Australian.
But I was a very advanced child. Yeah.
Just started school when the last Australian Prime Minister was able to retire of his own choosing.
Look, he'd been threatening to do it for a very long time, and they gave him one more election. But anyway, yes, go on.
So since then, McMahon, Whitlam, Fraser, Keating, Howard, Rudd have been defeated in the party room, and have been defeated in election. And Gorton, Hawke, Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull, all defeated in their own party room, I suppose Holt might have retired at his time of his own choosing, did he? Or did he just go for a swim when it was a bit rough?
Well, it depends. It depends if you go for the Chinese sub theory or if just a really dumb place to go for a swim theory, which is the one I go with. So it was just kind of like,
I'm pretty sure it was a Chinese sub, really. You know.
Well, yeah. Well, look, we're going to have to differ about that. And if you're right, of course, Harold will reappear at some point. Will reappear, possibly as a property developer in Sydney with some Chinese money behind it.
The real story for this upcoming election is that how few opposition leaders have actually won an election.
Yeah, and the last
it's about half. You know?
And what we saw in the most recent, not the most recent, the second most recent. I was thinking of Kevin Rudd, and Kevin Rudd did the small target. It was the Me Too stuff. Whatever John Howard said, he was all for. He just refused to be wedged, and it would seem that Labor under Albanese is playing a very similar game. I think I really dislike that small target stuff, and every political party wanting to form government, wanting to win an election, will do the same thing. And it's just a shame because once they get there, they should be hamstrung by what they can do and can't do. You know, what they have and haven't promised. I mean, carbon taxes and all that sort of stuff. Because you'll get punished by voters. So, hey, you didn't tell us you were going to do this. And that means that, you know, the small target thing means that reform and, you know, economic reform and tax reform and these sorts of things become too hard. I think that's one of the problems with the small target strategy. But having said that, when Shorten did the bigger target in 2019, he got smashed.
He did indeed. Hard to know how that's going to go, the small target approach in these circumstances. I think Labor's bigger problem than that is how does it manage to appeal to the traditional Labor seats, those marginal seats you talked about, or the seats that have become marginal for Labor. Most of them are full of tradesmen, working people, public servants, and also full of large migrant communities in some cases with traditional conservative social views. And Labor has struggled to maintain its vote in those communities, which used to be Labor voters pretty much consistently.
Well, the demographic breakdown of Newspoll over the last 3 months was published a couple of weeks ago, and that was, what they called Morrison's miracle workers, and we're talking tradies, and we're talking sometimes migrants, often in many cases migrants. Those people seem to have dropped off the government, and so there are some issues there. I mean, when we're talking about states, we often get states where elections will be won. We often do get, and for very good reason, we do get obsessed about Queensland. But the coalition has 9 seats in New South Wales that Labor would think are winnable. and on the basis of the New South Wales by-election, where the seat of
Gladys Berejiklian's seat.
no,
yes.
not Gladys's seat. We'll get to the Indies in a minute, but no, the coalition thought it had Gilmore in the bag. They've got the former state transport minister, former state treasurer in there as their candidate after parachuting Warren Mundine into the seat last time, and that was a bit of a disaster. It thinks it can now hang on in Gilmore, but the by-election in Bega, which takes up a fair bit of the sort of northern part of Bega, Gilmore takes up a fair bit of northern part. They had a smashing. That was a 13% swing. I know state by-elections don't necessarily translate to Australian federal election, but when we look at some of these regions, and the only thing we've got to go on is state polling and polling, state by-election polling, there were some big shifts there. And then we've got some of these real big concerns for the Liberal Party, in particular, these independent seats where they can lose blue ribbons. And we want to talk about them. So sometimes called the Climate Change it's Climate Change 200. It's a force that I started picking up in the 2016 state election in Victoria, where Brighton, Hawthorn and Kew were massive swings against sitting Liberal members. And they've got this problem coming up in the federal election now, where you've got the Wentworth is
Josh Frydenberg's seat.
Yeah, Frydenberg seat, Kooyong, one of the seats that's barely grabbed any attention, Mackellar, Bromwell Bishop's old seat, now held by Jason Feliski. I'll tell you that is definitely in play on the internal polling that I've seen. Zali Steggall looks like she'll hold on in Warringah, and that's the point. So if you start losing these seats, there are 3 independents in the parliament now, Wilkie and Denison, Tasmania, Helen Haynes in Indi, which has been an independent seat now for a long time. So is Denison, and Zali Steggall in Warringah. Once you lose them, and the coalition have lost, well, perhaps not Denison, but Indi and Warringah. Once you lose them, it's really hard to get them back. And if you do, look, I'll tell you right now that Josh Frydenberg won't be able to be doing a lot of national campaigning, because he will have to work on the ground hard in Kooyong just to hold that seat. There's Zoe Daniel is the independent candidate in Goldstein, and every chance as well. But from some people I know are involved in this caper, actually representing the Indies, they're saying, look, we don't think we may not win any. We may not win any. The campaign has just begun, but polling that we've got pre-election campaign announced shows that Mackellar's in play, Kooyong's in play, Goldstein's in play, Warringah will probably be held, and there's one other. There's one other that I can't think of. And my point about this is you've got the coalition government being attacked, let's say, from the centre. I mean, you might want to say, they're all lefties and all that sort of stuff. I don't really buy that. The candidates, the independent candidates showing up in these blue ribbon seats. The one I mentioned was North Sydney, but that's not really in play, I don't think. And the one I forgot to mention. They're the sort of candidates the Liberal Party would be proud to have when the Liberal Party was behaving normally, or the New South Wales branch of the Liberal Party was behaving normally. The point is that they go down, they won't get them back. And there could be very, very serious blow for the Liberal Party if they lose 3 or 4 of their blue ribbon seats, because that's so many more marginals that you've got to win next time around. And it doesn't seem that they've learned anything. They've put a hard right candidate in against Sally Steggall. So overall, the issue is that the coalition is being attacked by the left, as you'd expect from Labor, from the centre, from these independent candidates, all of them women, and from the right, from FON and UAP. And the only place they seem to be making a little bit of headway is on the right.
It'll be interesting to see.
Indeed it will. Now, look, we're going to wrap up our first show right now. That's a wrap for our first episode of Hats and Hi Viz. So I'm taking the fluoro off, Jack. Get that helmet off your head, unless there is a fire, because there was a lot of noise there. Unless there is a fire, keep the hard hat on if there is, just in case you have to make your way down, 16 flights of stairs. You'll need that.
It could be one of the candidates out there in a hard hat and a high vis, pretending to be a fireman,
building the scaffolding.
Scott holding the hose. I don't know. Anyway, next week we should start on the big issues, and I was amused on Twitter this week. The only reason I will look at Twitter is for amusement. Barry Cassidy, the former compere of insiders and offsiders, and
former press secretary for Bob Hawke as well, Prime Minister Bob Hawke.
He was getting stuck into a little bit of an argument with someone and talking about the Morrison government, and his parting comment was, "This is the election when climate change finally arrives as an issue and they don't see it." There was a little bit of an element of the boy who cried wolf about that. I thought that Barry's saying this is the issue this time and time again, but this time he really means it.
Well, it probably is in many electorates, and those are blue ribbon liberal electorates, and that is a big problem for the Libs. As I would think, Labor don't want it to be a big election campaign issue, because all of a sudden it will mean they have to speak with forked tongue, and it would, or at least with a tongue
in the cheek.
On one side of the cheek in those inner suburban seats, and then popping up to regional Queensland to put the tongue on the other side of the cheek.
And for our listeners who like a bit of entertainment, make sure you catch next week's episode in particular, because if you like a bit of disagreement, climate change, there's going to be plenty.
Well,
I lack the gift of faith. I was raised Catholic, and that's how I prefer to think of it. I lack the gift of faith in the whole thing. So,
well, look, you are an Eastern Suburbs. You were an Eastern Suburbs resident, so you may be. You may have to, or you might still make a choice between Dave Sharma and the independent candidate there.
Well, I can disclose that for some bureaucratic mix-up, I am no longer on the electoral roll, so I'm unable to vote. Which means that whoever's the Labor candidate who's not going to win in Whitworth won't be getting my vote as they otherwise would. Yeah.
This is the Peter Garrett approach, by the way, you got there, Jack. It's like, I was an independent, I was off the roll, I don't know quite what happened, but now I'm a Labor candidate. So look, one thing we are going to look at next week is very funny scripted moments of election campaigns that fell apart. I've got a few stories to tell there about how campaigning was just so rigorously controlled and rehearsed and practiced and planned, how it can just all fall apart in seconds and become very, very funny. So that's one we're going to have a look at for next week. We'll have polling, we'll have betting, we'll have all sorts of things to look at, and we might even talk about climate change if Jack can control himself for a moment.
We will.
So, see you later, listeners.
Cheers.